Human trafficking figures drop for the first time in 20 years. But the good news ends there. The UN says the decrease is less a result of active prevention and more a consequence of reduced reporting and detection. I'm Melinda Nusafora, and this is The Newsmakers. The number of people being trafficked has declined by 11%. That's according to the latest UN report. 47,000 people globally were victims of trafficking in 2020, and 50 million others were victims of modern slavery. The data was taken from 141 countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the drop can be attributed to three main factors: reduced capacity to detect trafficking victims, reduced opportunities for traffickers to operate, and victims being moved or concealed in other locations. The report also suggests law enforcement agencies were hindered during the pandemic, resulting in more people than ever relying on self-rescue. Almost 39% of people were trafficked for sexual exploitation, while another 39% were trafficked for forced labour. The UN is warning that the current wars, the climate crisis and the cost of living pressures will likely exacerbate the problem, and says we need to change the way we tackle this crime.
First, focus on the most important aspects of human trafficking, which is the organised crime element. This is where the money, the big money are. This is where most of the victims are trafficked as far as numbers. This is where most of the violence is. And that's where, the times where people get in traffic is longer. So that's what we need to focus on. Second, money generated by this crime. Where do they go? Who benefits? And this is something that we don't look hard enough into. I keep saying that if countries did the same efforts that they're doing on drug trafficking, on human trafficking, then the results could be different. That's what we need to see. And this will not happen until trafficking becomes a security threat for them. That's when I think we'll see real movement. And then third, I think we need to really look at how the crime mutates, and I use this word consciously because it changes. It adapts. We see forms of trafficking that we did not see before, and they become quite prevalent in certain regions. So we have to become very aware of what is happening.
Well, joining me with her own personal experience is Francisca Awa Mbuli. She herself is a survivor of human trafficking and the founding director of the NGO Survivors Network. Francisca, we appreciate your time so much here on The Newsmakers. If you could begin by just briefly sharing your journey and your story with our audience.
Thank you, Melinda. I'm Francisca. I'm reporting from the hinterlands of the eastern region of Cameroon, where we are presently carrying on work there. Actually, Francisca, you already noted, I'm a survivor of sex and labor trafficking. I was trafficked in 2015 to Kuwait, and I arrived Kuwait not because I was going there knowing fully that I was going to serve as a housemaid or a domestic servitude. I was being cajoled to go and teach English language in Kuwait, but on arriving Kuwait, there was no teaching job existing. Instead, I was being forced into domestic servitude, which I accepted because there was no need for me to turn back home, because there was nothing promising for me to lay my hands on back home for livelihood and to sustain myself and my immediate family. So I was trapped to do what I was not happy doing. I accepted it with my whole heart, but it was all a nightmare. It was one of the worst that I can always remember in the tickle of an eye every time I remember what happened to me. I was overworked. I was in Kuwait for just 3 months. I was overworked. There was no salary. I was treated more or less than an animal. I was being stigmatized. I was abused. Everything I think can happen to someone happened to me there.
How did you get out, Francisca?
Actually, I had a cell phone that I bought myself. While I was there, I always turned on CNN and during the time for CNN Freedom Project advert, I always have a pen and a paper on me in my Kadama dress. We're being termed Kadama, which means slave. So I always hold on to a pen and a paper. Every time the advert is on, I take down names of organizations that pop up and I write to them severally. Many of them will send me an automatic email, but finally, one of them called Freedom for All, based in New York, replied me personally one on one, and we pick up from there. They followed me all through my journey to rescue, which finally I ran away to the Central African Republic embassy there, and then they followed it up until I got my traveling documents, which was seized at the airport, and finally they funded my flight back home. That was
Francisca, how much of a stigma is there associated with speaking out and identifying as a survivor? How much bravery has it taken for you?
the stigma there is 100%. If there was something more than 100%, I would associate that to the stigma. It doesn't always start from your community, but it starts from your immediate family. From Cameroon and a Cameroonian perspective, when you leave your country and you are getting into an aircraft, they don't care if you're going to anywhere. They just see it as a privilege, and anybody getting on board on an aircraft is somebody that is already large or is somebody that has already been successful in life. So when you return back with all the promises that your family were looking up to you, the stigmatization starts from them. Coupled with the fact that I was sexually harassed and abused, it's a taboo in an African community to be pointed as somebody who have gone through that, and then you are there out in the open to speak out about it. The stigmatization is still on up to today, even
So,
though I'm in the fight.
so Francisca, how do you encourage other survivors to speak out through the community work that you do, to be involved in preventing and educating other women to not fall into the same trap?
Yes, the work we do, people will always relate that there's funding is the key to what we do. But directly to your question, my ordeal, my story, what I went through is my greatest asset. I don't play with it. It's that's a simple trick I use even to provide psychosocial support to survivors I meet. By telling them what I went through, gives them that opening to free and open up to me and also explain their story. Secondly, it gives them that opportunity and zeal to know that there's someone who have been through what they have been through and is out there making that change. And not only that change, but the change has gained me a lot of visibility that so many survivors now, instead of me struggling to get them on board to join this fight, not even being included in the fight, but to engage in this anti-trafficking movement, many of them are using my story as a tool to spark up to join the fight. A
We've
great
been looking at a UN report that really shows that sub-Saharan Africa is overrepresented with victims of human trafficking. Why do you think it's such a problem on the continent?
it's such a problem in the continent because there's a lot of political unrest. Notwithstanding, I will not even rely on that. There is a lot, as I highlighted during my first question, there is a lot of peer pressure. Many families have people abroad, and the way they make the community feel that it's all gold over there, spark up many people to want to have that push to always move out of the country. We in the South and West and Central Africa and then Sub-Sahara in general, we are often regarded to as the exiting country because there's a lot of push factor pushing us out. Climate change, on the other hand, is not leaving things down. It's
Is
really
that
ravaged.
climate change making people more vulnerable?
Climate change is another aspect. Political unrest is really doing a lot. And then peer pressure. Economically, it's really down. And we all know the root causes of human trafficking is mostly poverty, associated with unemployment, lack of jobs for school graduates. There's a lot of untold suffering that is really harsh and pushing people to move out. And it takes a lot of guts for us who have really seen it and have decided to stay to make that change. Notwithstanding, on the other hand, from a survivor's perspective, it's somehow very difficult to really look at the survivor centered side of it because many survivors are fearing and being gearing away from standing up
to speak out. So
What,
that's why we always relate to victims and forget about the survivors that are also part of the show from sub-Saharan African countries.
Francisca Awa Mbuli, we appreciate your bravery and your willingness to speak out here on the Newsmakers. Thank you for your time. Let's bring in our three experts now to expand on our discussion. From Pristina, we have Anxhela Bruci, the founder of Empowerfull, an organisation assisting human trafficking survivors to successfully reintegrate into the community. From London, we have Philippa Southwell, Managing Director of Southwell and Partners. And also from Washington, D.C., Sunny Slaughter, a law enforcement instructor and founder of Sunny Slaughter Consulting. Ladies, thanks for being here on the Newsmakers. First of all, Sunny, I want to start with you. The report that we've been looking at from the United Nations shows that the number of detected victims fell for the first time in 20 years. Is this a result of good progress, good law enforcement, or is there just a decrease in detection?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I would like to believe that there is good law enforcement in one aspect, but also that with the pandemic and over the 3 years, many individuals who were and continue to be trafficked and exploited have gone quiet and silent, and we need to locate individuals and know that there's opportunity there for them to be assisted and served. So while I believe law enforcement efforts have been progressing, I still do not think that we are doing enough.
Philippa, I feel like Sunny's comments there reflect something that you have said in the past, particularly with regards to this report and other data. You've said it simply doesn't reflect the scale of the problem. You're one of the UK's leading litigators with regards to human trafficking cases. So why are so many cases not being identified?
It's correct that all of the data that has been published is never going to reflect the true scale of the problem. There are thousands of victims around the world that are not identified as victims. Many do not self-identify as victims. So it is on the frontline professionals, that's law enforcement, lawyers, grassroots organisations, social workers, NGOs, and medical professionals to identify these vulnerable people when they come into contact with them. They need to be picking up what those indicators are. And there is a wealth of case law and guidance that says that the victim does not need to formally identify themselves in order to engage our various legal obligations. So really, there must be more training and specialist training for these types of professionals, law enforcement, judges, lawyers, medical professionals, in order to pick up what those indicators are.
I'm definitely going to come back to you, Sunny, for a response to that exact point. But before we get to law enforcement changes, Anxhela, I just want to ask you, you have spoken in the past about how we as a global community often don't have an accurate perception of what human trafficking is. It's not always organised crime gangs, is it? Tell us more about what you've come across in your experience.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. I think it's very important to also raise awareness on this issue, because usually we view human trafficking or modern slavery as an issue that is only an organized crime group activity. But actually what I've seen with the cases that I've worked with is something that can happen also to our neighbor, and it can happen through close family relationships or through the lover boy method, especially in the Balkans or with the cases I've worked with in Albania. It's usually the lover boy method, where someone promises false love or makes you believe that they are your partner and you will have a very happy life. And then the nightmare begins when you cross the border or when you start your life with your partner. And I think the more we raise awareness on this complexity and the more we understand that actually human trafficking is not only something that happens as sometimes media portrays it, for example, chains or shut mouths, is something that can actually happen to each and every one of us. And I think that's also very crucial.
So, Sunny, how difficult does that make law enforcement? If you're not targeting specifically organised crime, how do you improve our law enforcement tactics to tackle individuals like what Anxhela's been describing?
I agree with both of my colleagues. I just think the misinformation and disinformation around human trafficking is so prevalent in our society. And with the lack of training, the formal training, the guidance, that people are continue to miss this. They miss it as very subtle, very complex and nuanced, and it doesn't include change. And our as my colleagues have already stated, the training is really, really crucial, and people don't have to say anything, but you need to be aware of what those complex nuances can be. And law enforcement and medical professionals and dental professionals, that is an organization that I have also targeted, and age and gender, all of these things matter. And we cannot let go and just relax what we are doing. And I applaud my colleagues. I applaud this program for really reining in that the data is not only the numbers, those are individuals, but those are not reflective of what is really happening. And we must not ever stop having these conversations.
And so, Sunny, how then do you think that law enforcement officials are aware that their practices are lacking? Is this something that you think is being adequately addressed?
I don't think it's being adequately addressed. I think we get comfortable with saying that there's a media story and 168 or 98 people were rescued. That is not an accurate figure. I think law enforcement must do more. There must be more training by those that actually don't fit into the narrative of what this looks like and really gets to the nuances. There's a comfortable narrative. Well, you should look for this and you should look for that, but then you miss a whole segment of people. And law enforcement really needs more training, more specific training, and more opportunities to collaborate globally around this problem, not just in the United States and in one location. We need global efforts to address a global and very systemic problem.
Philippa, let me ask you then. We've heard from the United Nations saying that if human trafficking was treated the same as drug trafficking and considered a security problem to like national security, prosecution would be much easier. Do you agree with that statement?
To some degree, yes. I mean, if we look at, for example, the UK legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, offences of trafficking are punishable with up to life imprisonment. So it's very much up there in the scale of severity of criminality. I think particularly in UK and Europe, we are seeing very low prosecution rates of trafficking cases because, again, we are failing to identify victims in the first instance. And many times we're criminalising those victims for their involvement in passport offences, drug offences, sex offences. And then we are then expecting them to cooperate as a victim at the same time as a defendant in a case. And I think that this illustrates the complexities of types of exploitation that we see around the world. And as Sunny has said, it's not just the traditional conceptions of what trafficking is. So, it doesn't have to be cross-border. It's not just sexual exploitation. It's, forced criminality, forced labor, domestic servitude, forced marriages. It really does encompass a very wide umbrella of types of exploitation. People are being used as commodities, and quite rightly, as my colleagues have said, it's not just by serious organised crime networks, it's by individuals that are exploiting another individual, whether that be in a domestic servitude setting, in the workplace. And again, it really is re-educating ourselves as to what human trafficking and modern slavery is in a contemporary setting. And again, there is the myth surrounding that. In the same way that we had rape myth 10, 20 years ago, we have those same misconceptions about what human trafficking and modern slavery looks like.
Anxhela, do you think that there are some victims of human trafficking who also don't understand and don't identify that this is the situation they are in.
Unfortunately, yes, that also can be the case, and it can really hinder in the identification process. We might have cases where the victims themselves don't recognize themselves as victims, or they think they are worthy of what they're going through, either because they come from dysfunctional families or the root causes, such as poverty, dysfunctional families, living in deprived areas or in a developing country, might make you believe that you need to go through struggles and suffering in order to grow or to go to a better place. And I think this is where organizations or maybe international organizations, when they provide funding, they can really look into it. So they
I was going
target
to
root
ask you, how do
causes.
we address that? You know, what would your recommendation be to national, international organizations?
Thank you. I think from our perspectives as grassroots, as a grassroots movement here in Albania, is when it's not all about funding. For me, it's also about listening to the voices of survivors and of those who have been through human trafficking, because they know themselves what were the methods they were used or how they were deceived. So in this way, we can inform a better programming that is not only efficient in terms of the resources that they use, but it's also effective. It really responds to why this has happened at first place. And also, even though this is a global problem, I think when we look into the local context, it can really help, because cultural values, religious values can also get into the complexity of being effective when you implement a program and when you try to prevent human trafficking. So I think that would be international organizations working really closely with local communities, of course, experts, but also those who have really experienced the depths of what human trafficking feels like.
What this recent UN report also highlights is just how vulnerable people are during conflict situations and the migrant flow that stems from that. So, Sunny, with what we're seeing at the moment with migrant flows from Ukraine, etc., how much of a vulnerable position does that put them in, and how do law enforcement then need to tackle that?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And law enforcement needs training about the cultural vulnerabilities and what that looks like. I think we do a lot of other training in law enforcement, but not enough training that really centers the vulnerability of people from a cultural standpoint, from an ethnic standpoint, and what that looks like and how we treat and recognize and identify those that sometimes get criminalized but not identified as victims. And it also makes it difficult for law enforcement, because when you think about the intersection of migrants and populations that they're not used to engaging, or that they're used to engaging from a criminal standpoint, and then you add politics on top of that, it becomes an even more complex problem for law enforcement in terms of training, identification, recognition, responsibility, and how they engage from a humanity standpoint. And I don't think that we do that enough with law enforcement, really getting them to recognize the ground roots humanity of individuals who are impacted by human trafficking. That's not part of the training, and it really should be.
Extending on that, Philippa, I want to ask you, how important is it to have victims, or should I say survivors, really playing a more important role in instructing prevention and those kinds of interventions with regards to human trafficking?
I think that we can learn a lot from evidence from victims. I mean, I routinely see the same names, the same exploiters, the same trafficking routes from certain countries, and that is information that they haven't shared with law enforcement because they're being criminalized, for example. We need to listen to victims. We need to listen to what their issues are with why they don't self-identify, or why they have fear for law enforcement and authorities, and offer more support. The problem that we are seeing is that there is this hostility, particularly if we're talking about those that are fleeing conflict and are being smuggled into the UK or whichever country it is. We're also seeing the conflation of the legal definitions, particularly in the media, with migrants fleeing and being smuggled into countries. Many of those victims who have been smuggled go on to be trafficked because they are in a position of vulnerability and are in a debt bondage for their passage to their destination country. So the legal definitions become conflated. It's not a straightforward issue, and many victims are, when they arrive in their destination country, are extremely vulnerable to exploitation by organised criminals and individuals.
There is obviously still so much work to be done. We appreciate your expertise here on The Newsmakers. Thank you for drawing it to all of our attention. And thank you to our audience for watching. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Melinda Nusafora. We'll see you next time.